Bubbles. Right, I'm not a finance guy, right? I'm an econometrician, so you can start hassling me about what bubbles are and what they mean, but you won't get an interesting discussion from me. I'm going to talk to you about statistical inference, about trying to pick up bubbles where we're specifying them as the kind of the way Peter Phillips has done, I guess you could say, in a voluminous already contribution to the literature, where we're looking at periods of explosivity in little parts of the sample. Now, Peter has been on a cruise ship for the last 6 weeks, I believe, going from Auckland to Vancouver. And he's told me that he hasn't really left his cabin, and he's been sitting on a little laptop working away. So, Roderick, we can expect probably another 6 papers on bubbles to be appearing in the next few weeks. Now, what motivated us in this piece of work is that if you look at a lot of the literature on bubbles, it's actually kind of followed, almost paralleled, a literature that I worked on a few years ago called persistence change, which is where you have a null hypothesis as usual in unit root tests of a unit root throughout the sample, but your alternative is that there are little windows within the sample where there's mean reverting behavior. And so there are things like government deficits. Sometimes people argue that that kind of behavior may be seen in those kind of data when you think about different periods of government where one government, like a Labour government maybe, might spend like there's no tomorrow, although the leader of the Labour Party didn't admit that, did he, in the question time thing. And then another period of government where they rein in expenses and we go into austerity and all this kind of stuff. So in that kind of literature, you would use Dickey-Fuller tests primarily in subsamples to see if you could pick up that kind of behavior. And it's essentially a backward-looking procedure. So you get a sample of data, you sit here in 2015 and you look back and say, was there a period of stability in the sample? And then someone comes along and says, ha, but there might have been 2 periods of stability. Yeah, that's a point, or maybe more. So then you have to get a multiple procedure and say, well, yeah, there was some periods that we might find. And exactly the same thing has happened in bubbles. So they came along and said, well, here's a test for an explosive rational bubble in a financial or price series in particular, as we'll look at here. Well, yes, that's very interesting, but there might have been 2. Oh, yes, well, indeed, better develop some tests that do 2. By the way, the tests are exactly the same as the persistence change guys use, except they just look in the other tail, and instead of looking for the most negative, they look for the most positive. Not a huge leap of faith in that kind of approach. And I say, yeah, well, here you go, 2, brilliant. Well, maybe this is something that's worth doing in that way with looking backwards for periods of stability. But is it really what you want to be doing if you're testing for bubbles? I don't know. I don't work in the city, right? So I'm not particularly bothered about if I can pick up a bubble tomorrow because, I earn an okay wage. It's not fantastic, but it's not terrible. So I'm quite happy poopling along doing my little crossword puzzles like I do at work every day. But the kind of people who trade in these kind of things, it's interesting and important to them. Are they entering a bubble? So they don't really care whether I've got a fantastic procedure that can date the South Sea bubble. So, yeah, brilliant. Well, we know it happened, and your procedure picks it up. Well done. Fantastic. But what about now? So the kind of approach here is to try and move this literature forward a bit to what I think that the practitioners looking for these things are actually interested in, and that is to say real-time monitoring. That is to say, can we apply tests as we move through a set of data, a particular point in time, and find the procedure that is the most likely to tell us we're in a bubble when we're entering a bubble. I'm not interested in the procedure that's most able to tell me there was a bubble 50 years ago. This is of no interest for what I'm talking about today. This is about finding things at the end of the series, because if you're doing real-time monitoring, that's where you want to pick up the bubble, right? Because you're saying, am I entering it? So this is joint work with Sam Astle, who's a former PhD student when I was at Nottingham, with Dave Harvey and Steve Laybourne, who are still at Nottingham. So we'll look at methods for detecting periods of explosive behaviour, and we're going to look at where that episode is ongoing at the end of the sample, so the end of sample bubbles. And I'm going to use a technique that some people in econometrics will know about what techniques in econometrics didn't Don Andrews invent, but this is work that dates back to 2003, and then he subsequently applied it to with Kim in 2006, there's something called breakdown of co-integration. So this is the argument. It's a bit like persistence change, in fact. It's the idea that you have a co-integrated relationship between two or more series, but then at the end of the sample, the relationship might break down. So it's a similar kind of thing here. What we're looking at then is a kind of different problem where it's a random walk, but that might break down at the end of the sample into a bubble. So you can kind of use the same techniques. And the clever thing about it is it's a subsampling technique. So what it does is it generates its own critical values. This is not a bootstrap. We're not making resamples. This is a subsample. So basically you treat a certain part of the data as a pre-putative bubble, if you like, and then you have a part of the data that you think might be a bubble. You can call that your bubble test window, if you like. And what you do is, let's say that's 8 observations long. You then do rolling windows of 8 observations through the whole of the previous part of the sample and use that to generate critical values from an empirical distribution function. So no having to look up asymptotic critical values, which, as of course we know in the kind of sample windows we might be looking at here, are not going to be much use. Also, another advantage of it is that as long as the properties of the data generating process, and I take on board problems of model misspecification we heard about before, and in fact this procedure is quite good for that because one of the problems you have with applying subsample Dickey-Fuller type tests is that if you've got any serial correlation in the errors driving the AR, let's say it's an AR1 driven by some noise, then the problem is that that shows up in the limit distribution unless you put sufficient lags in, and there's a rate at which the lags have to go off to infinity to mop up moving averages and so on. That doesn't really help you when you're doing little tiny windows of observations. You can't really be sticking in 20 lags when you've got 10 observations to work with. This is quite useful because there's no particular problem with running a Dickey-Fuller test without including stationary lag dynamics to mop up serial correlation. All you get is a limit distribution that depends on the serial correlation. But this subsampling method will be subsampling some things with exactly the same distribution. So they're non-pivotal, but those critical values will take into account the nuisance parameters from unmodeled serial correlation. So you get a huge problem with the Dickey-Fuller type approach that Peter Phillips has put forward, that you have to basically, their advice is put one lag in. Don't even bother with lag specification testing, just put one lag in. Hopefully, and the argument is, well, hopefully there isn't too much noise in these kind of series, so that'll pick it all up. Well, that may or may not be true, but here we'll see that this method can get around that. And we're going to have a look at tests. Well, essentially Andrews' test is going to turn out to be the best thing to do, which can have greater power than the Dickey-Fuller type tests to detect such things. Okay, so the usual kind of setup in this kind of literature, a time series Y, which has got a constant. You could think of more rich deterministics, but I don't think most people in finance think that's worth bothering with. And a U process, which is driven by a random walk up until time t, and then from t plus 1 through to t plus m, we change this parameter phi, which could be 1, in which case this would be the null hypothesis, we would have a random walk all the way through, or it could be greater than 1, in which case we have this kind of m-period bubble at the end of the time series. We're going to make assumptions on the innovation process. If you want a full and horrendous list of all the assumptions, have a look at Andrew's paper, but it's essentially the same assumption, that it's mean zero stationary ergodic. Okay, now the idea in all of this, when Andrews sort of first exemplified the work, is that it's not like the usual structural break test analysis, where you talk about windows which must be of asymptotically, asymptotically the window size must increase. In other words, they're a fixed fraction of the data. Like 20%, a window might be 20% of the data, so that as the sample increases, so that increases too. Here, the idea is that you keep this end of sample period to be small relative to the remaining sample. And if you wanted to put it another way, a fixed length is not going to be thought of as increasing with t. Which is, I guess, ultimately it doesn't really matter. All these things still work. So you can still get power with Phillips type tests when you have a finite length of this kind of sample period. And these tests here will still work if you have some kind of increasing length at the end. But we're just using the kind of this idea that you're looking for a bubble in only a few observations at the end of the sample. So it makes sense to think of it as some kind of small number.
Would it still be sensible to let t...
Oh, t goes to infinity, yeah. Okay, so I just said I wasn't going to talk about finance, but if you want things about finance, then you know that you've got to find a fundamental, and that's got to have a unit root all the way through, and then you need to find some kind of, if you are defining bubbles as those driven by locally explosive behaviour, then some kind of period of explosive behaviour. And you would then interpret that as a bubble regime. And of course, we know that there are many competing arguments about what could be the model for a bubble, but this is the one that's particularly being used in financial econometrics because it lends itself to very, well, it's not quite correct to call them classic methods of testing, but well-known methods of testing. Okay, so Phillips and co-authors have two particular tests they look at, the GS-ADF and the BS-ADF. And the GS-ADF is basically, well, it's basically something that Steve Label and I did in studies in nonlinear dynamics and econometrics for the persistence change model, but it's basically an ADF test run on fractions of the data from R1 through to R2, and then you basically do a double sup. So it's like, if you think of recursive least squares, or recursive Dickey-Fuller, you might do a recursion through the data. This is like a recursion where you move the start point, so it's like a double recursion. Some people think about it as like a moving rolling window where the window can become wider as you go through. So it's like a double recursion. And the idea is that it should be able to pick up individual periods of explosivity, because you're looking for a supremum here. So you're looking at large positive values of this Dickey-Fuller statistic. Okay, so standard augmented Dickey-Fuller, but run on subsamples, and this particular range of subsamples, and then taking the maximum over the double recursion. So it's a supremum. There's usual things, minimum sample size is important, and that's all discussed in Phillips's paper. And this R0 here, of course, as I mentioned before, is a function of the sample size. Sorry? Yes, that's what people tell me. The BS-ADF is, well, actually, this is the most relevant test that you would want to use if you were trying to pick up a bubble at the end of a time series, because it runs a Dickey-Fuller test from fraction R of the data through to the last point in the sample. And then basically, it's what's called a backward recursive. So then it backwardly recurses and then takes the sup. So this is actually primarily suggested by Phillips and co-authors as a way of date stamping. So in other words, you run these tests and they say, bubble, bubble, bubble. You know, oh, right, okay. Then you've got to say, where is the bubble? Unfortunately, the tests we talked about before are not so good at doing that, so they then have to set up a set of date stamping procedures, and this is primarily used in that. But if your particular attention was a bubble at the end of the sample, this is the most logical thing in which they've talked about that you would use. Okay. And that probably says all of that. Some empirical work in PSY, S&P 500 price dividend ratios, and they find a lot of bubbly type stuff going on, and they date stamp them with those kind of procedures I mentioned. I mean, that was a phenomenally simplistic overview. We're talking about a sequence of papers of 60, 70 pages each long, full of blizzards of algebra. So, you know, I have cut out huge amounts of what they actually do. Okay. Now, if you want to detect end-of-sample bubbles quickly, we think saying it's a finite length at the end is a more sensible thing to do. So therefore, what are the best tests that we know about in the literature that you would use to try and pick that thing up? And that is why we were then drawn to this approach of Andrews, because we knew that it had been, because just as, you know, the PSY stuff is using tests that was shown to work very well in the persistence change literature, similarly, this Andrews and Kim is a persistence change idea when you have a small persistence change at the end of the sample. So it's logical that that would be a sensible thing to use in this kind of setting. So you calculate your statistic of interest over a window of m end of sample observations rather than the sample as a whole. So you are not doing all this backwards and forwards stuff. You are just saying, here's the end of the sample, m observations, run the test. You then get the critical value for that by doing overlapping subsample methods. So in other words, a rolling sort of window of m observations through the sample, but not using any of the sample that you're testing on at the end. So you can think about splitting the sample in two. The first part, the large part of the sample, is to generate the critical values for the same statistic functional form that you're then applying to the M observations at the end. So that then gives you a large number of these, t is going to infinity, so asymptotically large number of these things, and then you can use them in the usual way, plot them in an empirical histogram, and pick out the quantile that you want. Okay, and we're looking to test 1 against greater than 1, and we're going to use, the type of test that Andrews suggests, which is a locally best invariance stability test, and also some other statistics I'll talk about in a minute, one of which will be Dickey-Fuller. Well, here it is. So this is the idea of Dickey-Fuller, is that you would run it from the last M observations of the sample, and then you would use rolling windows over the previous observations to calculate the critical value that you would then use. Note, lag difference augmentation is not required because dependence in, well, epsilon was in the model, this is the error here, is common to all subsamples, therefore this will automatically model that. We'll come to shortly, also things like heteroscedasticity or non-stationary volatility, as I called it. If you have periods where the variance changes, this is no problem for all of this because you're doing little rolling windows, and okay, so if the variance is following a pattern that goes boom like that, well, that's all these little regressions. As long as it's scale invariant, all these regressions you calculate here are fine because the variance is well estimated. All the ones up here are fine. You've got a little bit of overlap there, but that's asymptotically negligible, so you will still have a valid critical value. So you don't need to do something that, well, at least Roderick knows about. We looked at was how you can robustify the Phillips type tests to non-stationary volatility, so the idea that the variance might change over the sample. It's a particularly big problem in this kind of literature because explosivity and a big positive change in variance are pretty similar looking objects. So you need to kind of be aware of that, but this kind of stuff can handle periods of high and low variance in the sample. Okay, right. A simple alternative is in the Andrews type framework is something like this idea. Well, if the null hypothesis is true, then the first difference of the data is stationary. Now, under the alternative, you have stationarity up to the end of the sample, but then you have this kind of equation here, which is still explosive. So if you take the first difference of an explosive series, it doesn't make it stationary. It's still an explosive series. It's just got slightly different parameterization to it. So what you can do, therefore, is in order to satisfy yourself that you can apply the Andrews and Kim type approach, because you've got a random walk here, if you take the first differences, then under the null, you get down to a series with all the kind of properties that they assume. So they're, but still, an explosive window at the end. So you can, therefore, directly use the Andrews and Kim type test as long as you apply it to the first differences of the data. Now, technically, the R statistic is locally optimal against a change from I0 to I1. Now, if we difference this, this is not a change from I0 to I1, but that doesn't mean to say that it won't have power against it. It's not locally optimal, but it will certainly have power. And it looks like this. So this is the I haven't scaled this out by any variance estimate at this point, but this is, and technically, if the variance is constant over the sample, we don't even need to do that because it will automatically be accounted for in the calculation of the critical value. So if you generate your own critical values from the sample, you have automatic scale invariance as long as the variance is constant, but usually you put an estimate of sigma hat on the bottom of that. But this is just a locally best invariant test for I1 against I0. It's a KPSS test, if you like, without a long-run variance scaling, applied to the first differences. Now that thing will be powerful against upward and downward explosive series. Most people, I think, are more interested in, when they talk about bubbles, about upwardly explosive periods. So what you can do is take away the square on this and work with this kind of functional form here. And I think the simulations at the moment show that's slightly more powerful if you are sure that you're only interested in upward bubbles. Okay, oh yeah, okay. An interesting feature of all of this is that if you have a bubble that happened earlier in the sample, let's say it's 100 observations ago, and you're applying this test now, looking at, let's say, the last 8 observations, those things don't matter. As long as the number of observations is lower order than T. Okay, so if you had a period of 10 bubbles, 10 bubble width period, it would eventually disappear. So it wouldn't. We'll see it in the simulations in a moment. There's much more of an effect on the Phillips type tests, which have a particular crash property after a bubble, which actually is the whole reason about why they're very good at dating bubbles, because as soon as you hit the end of the bubble, these statistics go back to zero. They basically crash. The series crashes and the backward recursive test crashes. And it stays down at having zero rejection frequency for a long time after the collapse of the bubble. So it's very good at dating, but it's not very good if you've got periods of bubbles happening through the sample. Okay, and this is just the idea about if you wanted to think about volatility shifts in the errors, for example, then just scale out by the usual way, by the variance. So we call these things S star and R star. So these are not the Andrews tests now. These are, well, are what never was, but these are the scaled versions. Okay, you've got to make a choice of the window width, and you can play around with that, as we'll see. So I'm just going to give you some simulations here into sizes, the normal 5% level. The usual kind of Phillips setup, you put an initial value in so that you get generally upward bubbles. This is kind of a little trick to make it look like a sensible type of series. And this is just, we'll look at size for the case where it's a random walk all the way through and you've got a moving average error with thetas ranging from -0.5 to 1. So this is very uninteresting tables of numbers, other than to see that these are with assuming 5 observations at the end for your test. So the window you calculate over is 5, 8, 10. And this was the R star statistic. This is the Dickey-Fuller, 5, 8, 10 again. And this is the S star that we talked about, the sort of one-sided version. And this is the Phillips type test with one lag included following their suggestion. And you can see there's a little bit of oversize going on here. It kind of increases a bit. This is for 100 observations. So this is N, which is the T plus M. So it's not a huge sample size, I guess. This one is doing kind of okay, but you've got little problems here with undersize going on and some cases with that oversize. The problem here with undersize, of course, is that that will translate into very poor power if you had that kind of shock under the alternative.
Sorry, wasn't that theta?
Theta is the MA1 parameter here in the shocks that are driving the AR. And then increase it to 200, and it's getting slightly better. We've still got that massive undersize there. These are getting closer, and then you get to 400, and you're not too far off. So size, recall, no corrections in any of these whatsoever. These are the ones that I've got a lag in, none in here. Kind of look at heteroscedasticity. This black line is, so we're just putting a variance break in, lambda, through the sample from 1 to sigma squared. Sigma squared is on the axis here. So this is black line is the Phillips type test, and all the other lines are the ones we've been talking about. So you can kind of see what's happening there. This is halfway through the sample, and this is if you put the break towards the end of the sample, which is kind of the sort of thing that would worry you, because that's, you know, that's the last few observations in the sample are looking more explosive because of the increase in variance. And you can see that we're getting up towards 15% on the test, whereas these kind of subsampling tests are absolutely fine. You can talk about power as well. So here's a case where we have random walk up to 170. Then we have an explosive window up to 180. And then it carries it basically, this is the kind of Phillips model. It's a strange thing to do, but it's one particular way you do it. You set the sample, the observation after the end of the bubble to be where you were before the start of the bubble, and then adding on a random element, and then carrying on as a random walk. And so the idea here is just to see how do these things pick it up. So we've got all these various coloured lines here. This is the R test. These are all, I've done all these with 8 here. The paper itself has got all the 5 and the 10. And this is the black line, as before, is the BSADF. So the bubble starts basically here onwards. Okay, that's where the breakpoint happens. So 171 is the first observation with the explosivity. And you can see that all of them start to pick up power. This is with one, like one observation with explosive, and these things are starting to move. It's quite impressive. The Phillips type test, as you can see, is of these up until this point has the lowest power of all of them. At this point, the Dickey-Fuller is a little bit disappointing, actually. It's not although you might think it's the kind of thing you want to pick up explosivity, it's not doing the best job. These kind of other two tests, the red and the blue, really very good power with only a very small number of observations to pick these things up. And then after you crash out after the bubble, you can see this thing again. The black line here is flatlined all the way along the bottom. The red line, it takes a little while, and the green and the blue, but they do eventually recover after, well, however many, 8 observations or so, which isn't entirely surprising because, of course, that's the width of the window, right? So one full window later, and they're back to normal, basically. So that kind of idea there is that if you then add another bubble over here, these are going to be correctly sized and therefore more powerful. This is going to be down here, and I imagine that that's just increasing the parameter. You can kind of see the same kind of thing. And here's an end of sample just to show you what happens there. This is what I call a long separation. There's a bubble earlier on here, and it's so far away that even the BSADF is fine. And then we get over to here, and you can see the pattern is very similar to what we had before. So it's kind of, the one we had before was in the middle. This is just showing you what happens if you're kind of evaluating at the end. And here's where the bubbles are not too far apart. So we've basically got a bubble starting about here to about here, and then we've got another one starting about here. And you can see the problem with the BSADF is that it's still way down here. So if you're using it to pick up a real-time exercise, to pick up a bubble at the end of the series, this thing, if there was a bubble, reasonably not too far ago, this thing is pretty much useless. And it's clearly dominated by all of these. And we saw that even if there was no bubble, these other things will pick it up quicker. This is just a quick, I haven't seen a thing, but I must be over. 1 minute, good. So this is an application to, these are series that were looked at in the PSY paper where they kind of picked up some bubbles, and we had a look at, so the idea was, how do these, we'll look at S star because that turned out to be the more powerful test of the ones we looked at. How does it compare to BSADF? If you were doing like a pseudo real-time detection, so I'm going to just apply these as if I'm moving the end of the sample along. So I'm sitting there replicating what someone running these tests in reality would get, assuming there are no data revisions or all that kind of nonsense, but there wouldn't be with these kind of data, I guess. What would happen if they were sat at their desk running this each time the new data came in? The data is 87 to 2010. So we're going to replicate an ongoing exercise and see what happens. And this is what happens. So BSADF, for example, in the post-long depression, they pick up 1879 month 10. Now the S5 picks up the same, and you can see here that actually the 8 and the 10 are a little bit slower to pick it up, 1 month slower to pick it up. I don't know why that is. It may be maybe because there's some oversize in the ADF. That could be the reason. Who knows? If we look at the Great Crash, BSADF doesn't pick it up until 28 month 11, whereas these other statistics are all picking it up, a full year of observations early, and full year and 3 months of observations earlier. So they're picking this kind of bubble behavior up much faster, if you like, in the case of this series. Post-war boom, again, we're picking up earlier. Black Monday, the S5 doesn't pick up at all, but the S8 and S10 are picking it up a couple of months earlier than BSADF. And similarly here, we're picking up 95 month 11. These are 5 or 6 months earlier. They're picking up the dot-com bubble. So not always, but most of the time, the S-star test is picking up these bubbles sooner than the BSADF test, which is kind of what you'd expect in line with the Monte Carlos, because they suggested that in some of the cases there was quite a bit of difference in power, 30 or 40% power differences. When lines go steeply like that, it kind of often hides the fact of how much more power there is of one test over another. And I guess that's the end. So it's the Andrews type approach for end of sample bubbles. We're treating that putative bubble at the end of the sample as being a fixed finite length, which is a more reasonable assumption if you're doing an ongoing type of exercise. It's robust to level. I didn't talk about that here in the paper, but if you can put level shifts in as well, which absolutely kills Dickey-Fuller type tests, but not here. It doesn't kill. I didn't do that. Anyway, I don't think it hides anything particularly that you didn't know, so it doesn't matter. Okay, and a real-time exercise found, in general, most of the time, you would have, I put known there. I think they're accepted bubbles and the kind of BSADF picks them up. So it would have detected them quicker. So it looks like as a real-time exercise, it'll start hitting the red button quicker. That's it.